Karen wasn't just any neighbor on Maplewood Drive, she was the neighbor. The kind whose curtains twitched every 10 minutes, eyes narrowing like a hawk scanning for chaos among an otherwise peaceful flock. She didn't just live on the cul-de-sac. She patrolled it, watched over it, and depending on who you asked, haunted it like a ghost of suburban disapproval. Most neighbors had grown used to her presence, that ever-hovering figure behind the azalea bushes or peering over the top of her 6-foot fence. But to the newcomers, Karen was an unwritten clause in the HOA covenant, one they'd regret not reading. Her house stood 3 from the corner, trimmed in a beige so neutral it bordered on passive aggression, with a lawn mowed in obsessive straight lines. A wooden sign on her porch read, "Good fences make good neighbors," a gift she once told everyone at the block party she bought herself after reporting a teenager's skateboard ramp. The irony was lost on no one. Karen was known by name at every HOA meeting, not because she was on the board, but because she might as well have been. She never missed a single monthly gathering, her folders stacked high with labeled complaints, often color-coded and time-stamped. She treated rulebooks the way priests treat scripture. To her, the HOA guidelines were not merely suggestions, they were sacred doctrines of civilized life. And anyone who dared to step outside those lines was, in her eyes, asking to be corrected. Most people didn't know what Karen did for a living. Rumors swirled. Some said she was retired military intelligence, others joked she worked for the NSA, using Maplewood Drive as her cover. But in reality, Karen was a part-time online transcriptionist, which allowed her plenty of time to sit by the window, listening to conversations and watching every doorbell camera notification ping in real time. Her favorite activity, however, was walking her small, anxious-looking Pomeranian, Prince Barkley, around the neighborhood 3 times a day at precisely 7 a.m., 12:30 p.m., and 6:45 p.m. with a notebook tucked under one arm. Karen's complaints weren't always unreasonable. Sometimes she was right, a car parked too long in a red zone, or a neighbor who let their garbage bin sit out for 3 days past collection. But it wasn't the content of her complaints that wore people down, it was the volume, the tone, and the pettiness of it all. She once filed a complaint about a Christmas wreath staying up until January 9th. Another time, she protested a child's lemonade stand for being non-permitted commercial activity. And then there was the infamous inflatable flamingo incident of last summer, a neighbor's pool decoration that she claimed disturbed the aesthetic integrity of the street. Still, for the longest time, Karen's behavior was tolerated. No one wanted to be the neighbor who challenged her. There was always that feeling, better to let the storm pass than walk straight into it. Even the HOA board, comprised of well-meaning but increasingly exhausted volunteers, often just nodded and thanked her for her contributions. They thought if they placated her, she'd eventually tire herself out. But Karen did not tire. She doubled down. Behind closed doors, people mocked her. "There goes Karen, the neighborhood sheriff," they'd say. Kids made up ghost stories about her late at night, daring each other to knock on her door. One Halloween, a group of teens left a fake citation taped to her mailbox, citing excessive Halloween spirit suppression. She called the police. But beneath the laughter and whispers was a genuine sense of unease because while Karen might be a walking cliché of neighborhood surveillance, she was also relentless. The truth was, Karen wasn't born this way. A few of the older residents remembered a time when she was different 10 years ago, freshly divorced, moving into the neighborhood with a weary smile and too many cardboard boxes. Back then, she baked cookies for her next-door neighbors and complimented a little girl's chalk art on the sidewalk. But something shifted over the years. Some say it was loneliness that hardened her. Others say it was simply a personality trait unleashed once she had the time and space to fixate. Whatever it was, It had transformed her from a quiet resident to an authoritarian watchdog. When the Maplewood HOA installed a new online complaint portal earlier that year, designed to streamline legitimate concerns and reduce unnecessary paperwork, they hadn't anticipated Karen would treat it like her personal mission hub. She learned the interface in less than an hour. Soon, complaints came flying in digital, precise, time-stamped with embedded photos and GPS data. One complaint had a diagram. Another included a decibel reading she claimed to have recorded during a toddler's birthday party. It became a neighborhood joke. Don't sneeze too loudly or Karen will file a complaint. But for the people on the receiving end of those grievances, the joke wore thin. One neighbor was fined for having a bird feeder that attracted unwanted wildlife. Another was threatened with escalation after repainting their mailbox in a shade Karen deemed non-compliant, though it was in fact approved. Despite the mounting frustration, Karen remained convinced she was performing a public service. She saw herself as a guardian of order, the final bulwark against suburban chaos. When she looked at the cul-de-sac, she didn't see happy families and lawn chairs, she saw infractions waiting to happen. To her, peace could only exist through strict adherence to rules, and she was the lone enforcer in a world slipping into UNRULINESS. In her own mind, Karen was underappreciated, maybe even persecuted. She kept a file of what she called unacknowledged victories instances, where a neighbor corrected their mistake after she submitted a complaint. She believed this vindicated her. What others saw as nitpicking, she saw as evidence of positive impact. Still, the neighborhood's patience was thinning fast. There had been whispers of drawing a line, of the HOA needing to take action. But no one could have predicted just how far Karen would go in that one chaotic week. The week that would turn her into legend. The week she would file 12 separate complaints in just 7 days, an act that would bring the entire system she worshipped crashing down on her. But before that week, before the storm, Karen was just a woman in beige cardigans, walking her nervous dog, gripping her notepad like a sword. She was the queen of complaints, ruler of the rules, and at least in her own eyes the last responsible adult left on Maplewood Drive. It began on a Monday morning quiet, as most things were on Maplewood Drive. The sky was overcast, a soft gray that blended seamlessly into the rooftops. The neighborhood was waking slowly, sprinklers humming to life, garage doors groaning open, sleepy children dragging backpacks behind them. But in the neat beige house 3 from the corner, the storm was already brewing. Karen had started her day the way she always did, pouring herself exactly 1.5 cups of coffee, checking her community alert app, and opening the HOA portal on her laptop. Her Pomeranian, Prince Barkley, lay curled up in his usual spot by the patio door, glancing up only when the printer buzzed to life. Karen had spotted something from her upstairs window that disturbed her. Her neighbor Alan had parked his RV in the driveway. Not on the street, not in someone else's space, his own driveway. But Karen knew the HOA guidelines better than anyone. The rules clearly stated that recreational vehicles may not be stored in view of the street for periods exceeding 24 hours. This was day 2, complaint 1. By noon, the second complaint had been filed. It was against a new family on the block, the Rodriguezes, who had placed solar-powered fairy lights along their front walkway. Karen had taken a photograph the night before, zooming in to capture the offending twinkle. Her formal complaint listed non-standard lighting, potential electrical hazard, and possible invitation for rodents. It was a stretch, even by her standards. But to Karen, rules were rules. Exceptions didn't build strong communities. Complaint 2. By Tuesday afternoon, she had submitted 2 more. One about the McCleary kids playing with sidewalk chalk again. She attached an image of a colorful rainbow drawing and a crude dinosaur that she claimed lowered neighborhood decorum. The second was about an improperly secured trash bin that had tipped over during a breeze. She noted exposure of refuse, which in her mind translated to a sanitation concern, and, of course, a rule violation. Complaints 3 and 4. Wednesday escalated. Perhaps it was the weather humid and heavy, or maybe Karen had simply reached a tipping point. She filed a morning complaint about a vehicle of unknown origin parked near the corner, which turned out to be the nephew of the Parkers visiting from out of town. Regardless, Karen insisted a guest pass had not been visibly displayed. By midday, she reported a barking dog, one she couldn't confirm was barking for more than 5 minutes, but potentially indicative of neglect. By evening, she submitted another entry, claiming a decorative yard flag depicting a sunflower violated the HOA signage clause. The flag had the word "Welcome" written in CURSIVE. Complaints 5, 6, and 7. At this point, the HOA board began to take notice, not just of the volume but of the content. Each complaint followed a similar format, highly detailed, filed with photo evidence, and always ending with a formal request for action. Karen didn't ask questions. She demanded resolution. Her tone wasn't frantic, it was clinical, detached, as if she were reporting lab results. On Thursday, she reported a neighbor for running a small group workout in their garage with a few friends. Unlicensed fitness facility operation, she wrote. Later that day, she flagged a mailbox that had been repainted navy blue instead of the regulation-approved black. By dusk, she submitted her 10th complaint, this one about a lawn mower being operated after 8 p.m., breaking what she cited as the quiet hours ordinance. It was 8:07 p.m., to be exact. Complaints 8, 9, and 10. The neighborhood WhatsApp group lit up that night. Screenshots of HOA messages started circulating. Neighbors compared notes, realizing they had all received warnings or citations in the same 72-hour window. Frustration began bubbling to the surface. It wasn't just that Karen was complaining, it was the relentlessness of it. It was the feeling of being hunted for minor infractions, the sense that someone was always watching. On Friday, Karen filed her 11th complaint. This time, she reported the Jeffersons for unauthorized furniture, a swing chair hung from their front porch ceiling. It was charming, rustic, and well within property lines, but Karen insisted it constituted an aesthetic anomaly inconsistent with street uniformity. Later that evening, her final complaint of the week came in. She sent in a report about a temporary basketball hoop placed near the sidewalk, used by 2 children playing quietly in their driveway. Her description said, possible safety hazard, community image concern, and misappropriation of public visibility space. 12 complaints. 7 days. That weekend, the HOA board convened an emergency meeting. No one wanted to say Karen's name outright, but it hovered in the air like the scent of fresh fertilizer, pungent, inescapable, and overwhelming. The HOA president, a calm, middle-aged man named Mr. Dwyer, read aloud the list of Karen's submissions. There was a pause after the 7th complaint. Murmurs filled the room. When he finished, he removed his glasses, rubbed the bridge of his nose, and sighed. This isn't governance, he said. It's harassment. The board members agreed that Karen's behavior, while rooted in technical correctness, had become oppressive. What began as civic involvement had spiraled into what one member described as weaponized vigilance. They reviewed the HOA bylaws and found a clause rarely invoked regarding the abuse of procedural channels and submission frequency intended to intimidate or disrupt community harmony. It was vague, yes, but it gave them a lever. Outside the HOA boardroom, the residents of Maplewood Drive were uniting for the first time in years. Over barbecues and afternoon strolls, people compared their citations and began to laugh, not because it was funny, but because the absurdity had finally reached its peak. Someone created a meme of Karen photoshopped into a military uniform with the words, "Maplewood Patrol keeping you lawful." Someone else printed stickers that read, "I survived Karen's week of wrath," and handed them out at the Saturday market. Karen, meanwhile, felt vindicated. To her, 12 complaints in 1 week was not overreach. It was proof that she alone cared about maintaining order. She believed the HOA should be thanking her, perhaps even awarding her with a community vigilance certificate. She had no inkling that behind the scenes, her actions were about to backfire. The week that broke the HOA wasn't about a single outrageous complaint, it was about the cumulative weight of every minor transgression being treated as a crisis. Karen had turned neighborly errors into offenses. She had exhausted a system built for balance and exposed the limits of order taken to extremes. And now, the very rules she had wielded so fiercely were being examined not just for how they protected the community, but how they could be used to protect it from her. It started with a group chat. It wasn't organized. It wasn't planned. It was just a casual thread among a few neighbors on Maplewood Drive, venting about the latest wave of citations they'd received. At first, it was mostly confusion. Could a decorative sunflower flag or sidewalk chalk art become a finable offense? How could it all happen in 1 week? But as people began sharing screenshots of the HOA notifications, a pattern emerged, a name that kept surfacing in hushed mentions or attached photos from the complaint files. Karen. A pun. Silent current of frustration that had always flowed beneath Maplewood suddenly broke the surface. It surged with a force no one expected. The group chat ballooned from a few voices to over 30 neighbors in less than a day. People who hadn't spoken in months were now swapping stories, each more absurd than the last. One woman shared how her flower pot arrangement was deemed inappropriately asymmetrical. A father showed the warning he received about sporting activity noise during a family basketball game. There was even a complaint about a garden hose not being adequately coiled. Everyone knew who was behind it. No one else in the neighborhood had the energy or the ego to write that many complaints with that much detail. It wasn't just the petty nature of the offenses. It was the tone, the unmistakable condescension, the righteous obsession with rule enforcement. The way her reports read like a neighborhood surveillance file. Karen hadn't just crossed a line. She had drawn it in bold permanent marker, boxed it in red, and then filed a complaint about anyone who came within a foot of it. By Friday night, the group chat had taken on a life of its own. Someone changed the name to Karen Chronicles. People shared memes, parodies, and even dramatic readings of her complaint letters. But under the humor was something deeper. People weren't just laughing anymore. They were uniting. The complaints weren't isolated annoyances anymore, they were a community-wide problem. And people were tired of being policed in their own homes. On Saturday morning, a group of residents met informally at the small neighborhood park. It started with 5 of them. Then more arrived. Lawn chairs were dragged into circles, paper cups filled with lukewarm coffee were passed around. There was no official speaker. Just stories, grievances, and finally, questions. What are we allowed to do without being watched? Is there a rule against existing? Why hasn't the HOA done anything about this? The answers weren't clear. But one thing was, this couldn't go on. Someone proposed drafting a petition not against the HOA, but against the unchecked authority Karen had managed to accumulate through sheer persistence. It wouldn't be mean-spirited, they said, just a respectful request for the HOA board to consider enacting boundaries for individual complaint volume, and perhaps reviewing the intent behind persistent grievance filings. The idea was met with applause. The kids joined in too, sensing the shift in energy. A few teenagers who'd received complaints for minor things like playing music in the garage or riding scooters on the sidewalk decided to fight back in their own way. That night, they chalked a massive mural on the street in front of Karen's house. It was colorful, silly, and harmless. A giant rainbow, stick figures dancing, and in bold letters, "We still live here." It wasn't vandalism, it was a message. Karen saw it the next morning and, true to form, photographed it from 3 different angles and filed yet another complaint. But something had changed. The HOA, for once, didn't respond with a warning or a citation. They acknowledged receipt of the complaint but made no promises. They said they were currently reviewing policies related to community engagement and abuse of reporting tools. Karen, irritated by the vague language, called the HOA office that Monday. She left 4 voicemails. No one called her back. Meanwhile, the revolt spread. A few brave residents began leaving their trash bins out an extra day. Nothing scandalous, just a quiet message. More and more people began adding little touches of rebellion to their homes. A flamingo garden statue appeared in front of the Simon's yard, a clear jab at the infamous aesthetic disruption Karen had cited months ago. Someone hung wind chimes that played pop songs. Another neighbor hosted an impromptu lawn yoga session, complete with loudspeakers and free SMOOTHIES. It wasn't chaos. It was community. The group chat became a digital campfire where neighbors shared their offenses of the day, encouraged one another, and finally felt like they were living, not tiptoeing through their lives. Kids played without fear. Adults laughed louder. Barbecue smoke drifted across lawns as people started visiting each other again. Karen, on the other hand, felt the shift immediately. People stopped waving, stopped making eye contact. Prince Barkley's morning walk was no longer accompanied by cheerful hellos. The distance was tangible. For the first time in years, Karen didn't feel like the neighborhood's watchful guardian. She felt like an outsider. She tried to reassert control. More complaints, more emails. She cited obscure passages from the HOA rulebook. She mailed printed sections of guidelines to neighbors anonymously, though everyone knew who it came from. But her words had lost their weight. The fear was gone. The community wasn't afraid of her anymore. Then came the most powerful act of defiance yet. One family, quiet, private, rarely involved, hosted a block party. No permits, no planning committee, just an open invitation delivered to mailboxes. There was music, dancing, food trucks, lawn games, and homemade signs that read, "Maplewood, United We Stay." People showed up in droves. They laughed, shared drinks, even talked about organizing monthly gatherings to keep the momentum alive. Karen watched from her window the entire time. She filed a report: noise violations, unpermitted gathering, street obstruction. The HOA board never replied. That night, the residents of Maplewood Drive realized something important. They didn't have to live under one person's control. The power Karen thought she had was only effective as long as everyone played along. Once they stopped fearing her wrath, once they started seeing each other, defending each other, her grip slipped away. By the end of the week, the revolt had become something more permanent, a neighborhood reclaiming itself. Karen didn't know it yet, but the board was already preparing to act. Not out of spite, not out of anger, but out of necessity. The community had spoken, not with rage, but with unity. And no amount of complaints could silence that. The HOA board had never dealt with anything quite like this. Typically, their monthly meetings were uneventful, reviewing landscaping schedules, budget reports, or the OCCSIONAL discussion about repainting communal benches. But the recent chain of complaints, all sourced back to one resident, had forced the board into a territory they never imagined they'd navigate. How to discipline one of their own without setting the neighborhood ablaze. Mr. Dwyer, the HOA president, sat at the head of the table with a legal pad in front of him, scrawled with notes that had become increasingly frantic over the past week. To his left sat Denise, a soft-spoken retiree who usually handled community newsletters, and on his right was Marcus, a middle-aged school administrator with a knack for reading policy documents with surgical precision. The air in the boardroom was thick with unease. The 12 formal complaints Karen had filed within a week weren't just aggressive, they were suffocating. They represented a weaponized interpretation of the HOA rulebook, a tool that had been designed to maintain peace and harmony, but was now being used to fracture it. Mr. Dwyer tapped his pen anxiously. "We have to do something," he finally said. "This isn't oversight anymore. It's obsessive." Denise nodded quietly. "We've received 3 letters from residents in the last 2 days, formal ones. People are demanding an explanation for the citations. They're asking why. Nothing has been done about, well, her." Marcus cleared his throat and slid a printed packet forward. "I went through our bylaws last night. There's a clause, section 14.3. It allows the board to suspend privileges if a resident is found to be engaging in behavior that disrupts community harmony or weaponizes procedural mechanisms to harass neighbors." Mr. Dwyer took the packet and skimmed the section. "It's vague." "Exactly," Marcus said. "But it gives us room to interpret, and frankly, we need to. Because if we let this keep happening, we're setting a precedent that one person can chokehold an entire community using bureaucracy." Denise glanced toward the window. Outside, she could hear the laughter of children playing in the park, kids who, just a week ago, had been cited for riding scooters. "Do we think she'll push back?" "She will," Marcus said. "But we're not trying to ban her from the neighborhood. We're just suspending her access to HOA filing privileges temporarily, and we'll offer her mediation." There was a silence as the weight of the decision settled over them. Mr. Dwyer finally nodded. "Okay, draft the letter." 2 days later, Karen received the envelope. It was hand-delivered, stamped with the official HOA emblem, and carried the Senna weight of formality she usually reserved for delivering herself. She opened it on her front porch, Prince Barkley nestled beside her, unaware of the symbolic earthquake about to shift beneath their beige-tiled patio. The letter was polite, carefully worded, and firm. Dear Ms. Thatcher, after thorough review and consideration of recent community impact, the HOA Board has unanimously agreed to temporarily suspend your right to submit formal community complaints, effective immediately for a period of 90 days. This decision follows a substantial volume of submissions within a condensed period, many of which have raised significant concern among your fellow residents. The board recognizes your attention to the standards of our community and your right to voice concern. However, the volume and nature of these reports have been determined to create a pattern of disruption rather than constructive engagement. We invite you to a mediation session to further discuss your role within our community and explore solutions for future cooperation. Sincerely, Maplewood HOA Board. Karen stared at the paper for a full minute before reading it again and again. To her, it felt like betrayal. She had always believed herself to be the neighborhood's guardian, upholding standards others had grown too lazy or careless to follow. In her eyes, she wasn't the problem. She was the solution. The only one who cared enough to make Maplewood the picture of suburban perfection. The noise, the flags, the children's laughter, these things weren't just nuisances to Karen. They were threats to the illusion of order she had built around herself. She immediately walked inside, flipped open her laptop, and began typing. A blistering email addressed to the HOA board, demanding clarity, appealing to authority, quoting bylaws word for word, and accusing them of targeting her for doing what they refused to do, enforce the rules. But when she clicked send, something unexpected happened. Nothing. No automated reply. No out-of-office message. Just silence. She printed the letter. Then she knocked on Mr. Dwyer's door. He opened it after a long pause, wearing reading glasses and an exhausted expression. "I'd like to speak with the board," she said sharply, holding the letter like a subpoena. "We've already discussed everything in writing, Karen," he replied calmly. "You're not being punished. You're being asked to step back. I'm enforcing your rules." "Why am I being punished for doing your job?" Mr. Dwyer held her gaze. "Because enforcing the rules doesn't mean weaponizing them. And the neighborhood isn't thriving, it's afraid." Karen blinked. That word afraid hit something she didn't expect. She looked past him into his house, where his grandchildren were playing with blocks on the floor. She thought about the kids who'd drawn chalk rainbows. The woman next door who had strung up fairy lights for her daughter's birthday. The boy who played guitar on his porch every weekend. Had they really felt afraid? Had she done that? Back at home, she sat in silence, reading the letter once more. She looked out her window, scanning the street she had once monitored like a hawk. But this time, the thing she used to see as flaws an uncut patch of grass, a crooked wind chime, a trash bin left out a little too long suddenly looked human, not sloppy, not chaotic, just life. A few hours later, her inbox pinged. A reply from Marcus. "Karen, we received your message. We're open to having a mediation session next Thursday at 5 p.m. in the community hall. This isn't a trial. We're not interested in shaming you. We just want to rebuild something healthier for everyone. Let us know." Karen stared at the email for a long time. She didn't know how to respond. For the first time, maybe ever, she wasn't sure she was right. She looked at Prince Barkley, who tilted his head in that way dogs do when they're curious. But calm, and she whispered, "What if I really have gone too far?" It wasn't an apology. Not yet. But it was something. And outside, the neighborhood carried on. Chalk drawings faded slowly in the sun. Flags fluttered gently in the breeze. Laughter bubbled through the air like music. And for once, Karen didn't feel the need to stop it. The day of the mediation came quietly. No dramatic build-up, no neighborhood gossip circulating in whispered tones. Just a Thursday afternoon, the kind of slow-burn summer day where the air hung heavy and the shadows of trees stretched long across the sidewalks. Karen stood at her window for a few minutes before leaving, watching the world she had monitored for so long. The laughter of children echoed down the street, playful, unburdened. Sprinklers ticked and whirred from perfectly trimmed lawns. It was all so ordinary, and yet she felt like a stranger in it. The community hall wasn't far, just a 6-minute walk. But she drove, partly out of habit, partly because it gave her a moment to collect herself. The silence inside her car was different now. It wasn't the peaceful solitude she usually enjoyed. It was thicker, weighted with a mix of pride, shame, confusion, and if she allowed herself to admit it, uncertainty. For years, she believed her vigilance was necessary, that someone had to maintain the standards. But now the very people she thought she was protecting had stood against her. The community hall was nearly empty when she arrived. A long folding table had been set up with 5 chairs. 3 were already filled: Mr. Dwyer, Marcus, and Denise, all sitting with straight backs and polite but neutral expressions. There was 1 chair reserved for Karen, and 1 left intentionally empty, a symbolic gesture she would later realize, for the space left open to dialogue. "Thank you for coming." "Karen," Mr. Dwyer said, rising halfway in a gesture of formality. Karen nodded curtly and sat down. She placed her leather folder on the table, filled with documentation, policy excerpts, incident reports, photographs with timestamps. It was the same folder she always brought to board meetings. But today, she didn't open it. We want to begin by saying this isn't a disciplinary hearing, Marcus said. We're not here to argue rules. We're here to talk about the spirit of the community and how we move forward together. Karen folded her hands tightly. I'm not the enemy. I did what I thought was right. The rules are there for a reason. Denise leaned forward gently. We know you believe that. And we know you've always wanted the best for Maplewood. But intent and impact are different things. Karen tilted her head slightly, defensive. So now I'm being punished for caring? Mr. Dwyer sighed. No. You're being asked to pause and listen because caring too much without understanding others can become control. And people felt controlled, Karen. They felt watched, scrutinized, and reported for the smallest parts of daily life. I was upholding standards. At what cost? Marcus asked softly. 12 reports in a week. One family received a citation because their son left his bike near the porch overnight. Another because a toddler's inflatable pool wasn't properly screened. That's not enforcement, it's intimidation. Karen bristled but didn't speak. Not yet. We've had multiple residents, Denise continued, say they felt anxious in their own homes. Children afraid to play in front yards. Parents feeling they couldn't decorate for birthdays. The HOA became a symbol of fear instead of support. That's not what any of us want. Karen looked down at her lap, where her hands gripped the edge of her skirt. It felt surreal to be on this side of the conversation. For years she had felt empowered, even righteous. She truly believed she was the steward of order. But now the image was cracking, and behind it was something less noble. Something more isolating. I never meant to intimidate anyone, she finally said, quieter than she intended. I just wanted things to be clean, respectful, in line with what we agreed to when we bought into this neighborhood. That's fair, Mr. Dwyer replied. But those agreements are meant to serve people, not control them. We have to remember the reason behind the rules, not just the words themselves. Silence sat in the room for a moment. Then Marcus said, Karen, we're inviting you to join NOT. Monitor the community. Come to events. Participate in the upcoming Volunteer Garden Day. Talk to your neighbors. If something bothers you, try a conversation before a complaint. Karen looked up slowly. You're saying I can't file reports anymore? We're saying that for 90 days. We're asking you not to, he replied. Not to silence you, but to give space for trust to rebuild. After that, we're considering a new system, a limit to complaints per household per month, with a mediation step before formal enforcement. You can be a part of shaping that. Karen felt a sharp tug in her chest, a mix of indignation and invitation. She had spent so long on the outside looking in by her own doing. Perhaps that the idea of being welcomed back in felt almost foreign. I don't know if I'm good at people, she admitted, almost to herself. It's easier when things are black and white. Rules are clear. People aren't. Mr. Dwyer smiled faintly. That's the heart of it. People aren't clear, but they're worth the mess. There was another pause. Then Karen slowly opened her folder, not to argue, but to pull out a photo. It was of her front yard, perfectly manicured, with a dog statue she'd placed near the walkway, precisely positioned among her potted chrysanthemums, I thought. This was what being a good neighbor looked like, she said, sliding the photo forward. Quiet, orderly, predictable. I never realized it could mean something else, something louder. Denise smiled kindly. Sometimes being a good neighbor means waving at the kids who draw on the sidewalk, even if it's messy. Karen took a deep breath and nodded once. Okay, I'll try. That night, she didn't go straight home. She drove around the neighborhood slowly, with her window down, really looking for the first time in a long while. She saw the Simons family outside with their flamingo statue. She saw the Reed kids playing hopscotch near their driveway. She saw neighbors watering plants, talking, waving across lawns, and they saw her too. Some waved awkwardly at first, unsure, but a few smiled. A small boy on a scooter even yelled, "Hi, Miss Corinne." As he zoomed by, she smiled back, hesitantly, but it was real. The next morning, she rose early and walked Prince Barkley along the edge of the park. As she passed the community bulletin board, she saw a flyer for Neighborhood Planting Day. Volunteers needed. She paused, staring at it. And then, almost without thinking, she pulled a pen from her purse and scribbled her name on the bottom of the sign-up list. For the first time in a long time, Corinne wasn't standing apart from the neighborhood. She was stepping back in.